pleasure to be here this evening. I want to thank Dr. Vincent for inviting me, and for actually inviting me. The microphone go down over, please. Is that better? I really want to congratulate all you undergraduates for coming to a conference and presenting. When I was a junior at SUNY Geneseo, a professor took interest, and I showed some interest for plants, and he took an interest in me, and I did an undergraduate research project with him. And I went to a conference much like this. And right after the conference, I went on a job interview for a summer technician job. And I got hired. Part of it was because I was able to talk about it. I had just gone to this conference. And so, is that projecting good enough? You good? Yeah. Okay. So I can talk really loud. And so, you should be very proud of your work, and it really is meaningful. It's a great experience. And also, acknowledging your advisors and your mentors. They really put a lot into students. So, please do continue enjoying your meal. I have two different titles, and when you think about a title for a talk, a title like this might not really catch you because, well, it's catchy, but it's not that informative yet. So I'm going to give you a slightly more informative title, and I'm going to be talking about island biogeography, the theory of island biogeography, and we'll talk about species richness productivity relationships. And what I'm going to end with is a new twist that we developed based on our research in this system. And I want to acknowledge the funding for this research came from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. 25 undergraduates over the years participated in this research, and 2 graduate students. Both of those graduate students are now associate professors. And one of the undergraduates is a lead scientist at USGS. This is also a story of serendipity. This is a picture of Dr. Gary Polis. He's very famous for his study of spiders and scorpions. He wrote a children's book on scorpions, but he was also a very famous food web ecologist. And he was in this system because he was looking for spiders, and he just happened to go out to the islands, and he noticed that on cactus there were hundreds, 100 to 1,000 spiders per cactus. And this is a dry desert. It's like, well, so they're high on the food chain. How does this desert system provide those resources to move up and support this really high richness and diversity, so abundance? Unfortunately, I was down there for 2 weeks the first time I went down, setting up some experiments, and very sadly, he came down with a group of Japanese researchers, and they perished in a boating accident. So even though this work is inspired by Dr. Polis, I actually never got to meet him. So I'll very quickly just talk about island biogeography, and then I'll talk about species richness productivity relationships, and then I'll talk about the marine system, how it's very productive. I'll talk about the terrestrial system very quickly, how it's not productive, and what drives that productivity on the terrestrial system, which leads to a new twist on island biogeography, and then I'll end with one application for conservation. So hopefully in a general biology class or an ecology class, you have heard about the theory of island biogeography. It's considered about the only law in ecology. So when you think about laws and you think about your physics classes and your math classes, there's not really any laws in ecology. So this means that species-area relationships, first proposed by MacArthur and Wilson in 1967, and still a big part of ecological research, describes the species area relationship. And how it does that is pretty simple. You take samples across an area, and you count the number of species. You might also count the abundance of those species. And you get a relationship. And at some point, it's going to asymptote. And the beauty of this is if you then log transform both the y and the x-axis, you go from a curve to a straight line, which has a slope. And the beauty of the theory is that across thousands and thousands of studies, the slope, the z-value, varies between about 0.25 and 0.45. So that provides this very powerful mechanism to look at species area relationships. And you'll see that you can go to a Caribbean island and you can survey species richness across flora, fauna, so birds, plants, and you will get a z-value and you will get a very good fit for the predicted relationship. So the line is the predicted relationship and the points follow that line. So some of the conservation implications. Now you'll notice that on the y-axis, that it's not richness in this case, but it's population size. But the size of your national park for 3 different species, you log transform that relationship, you get 3 different slopes, and the obvious sort of conservation implication is the larger the park, the more abundant your particular species of interest will be. You can also apply this to local extinction. And so if you sample a very large area, you find a certain number of species, you can look at a relationship. What's going to happen if we lose 2,000 hectares? So you lose 4 species. But as you move down that line, the local extinction gets higher and higher. Now, unlike island biogeography, the relationship between species richness and productivity is really more in the hypothesis stage, and it'll never be quantifiable with an equation because it varies a lot. But one of the very common relationships is a hump-shaped curve. So lower productivity, lower species richness. At some point it asymptotes. And then as you increase productivity, species richness goes down. Now what's very important is, let's say you do an experiment and you only sample this much area, your relationship would be a positive relationship. If you sample a very large area, but you don't sample the small area, you just sample over a large area, notice that it's a negative relationship. That'll be important in combining these 2 ideas of island biogeography and productivity. So this is a system in the Gulf of California, so San Diego would be about right there, Tijuana. You drive down the Mexican peninsula, you're in the state of Baja California. If you keep going, you'll be in the state of Baja California Sur, Cabo San Lucas, and La Paz, very popular tourist places. But where we are is right there. It's called Bahia de los Angeles, which is the Bay of Angels. It's a small fishing village of about 500 people. There's about 40 or 50 families. And this big island right there is out here. And so here's this small archipelago of 12 islands. Now the beauty of the natural experiment is that these islands, they vary in size, they vary in shape, topography, but really what makes it just a beautiful natural experiment is that for whatever reason, on 6 of these islands, so this is an island that does not have birds. This is an island that has birds. Here's a fairly large island that has birds. Here is a small island that does not have birds. But seabirds influence 6 of the islands, and they pretty much stay away from 6 of them. The other interesting thing about the system is it's highly pulsed in terms of precipitation. This is the driest part of North America. Sometimes it does not rain for the entire year. Notice the range of precipitation is in millimeters. It has gone as high as 500 millimeters when there's been a hurricane, but the average is 52. But also note that the variation is actually greater than the mean. So it's highly pulsed. Some years there's lots of rain, some years there's no rain. The marine system is extremely rich. So if you see a whale, and this is a fish boil, if you're out there with the fishermen, they know where to go to take you to catch fish because they're looking for the seabirds. They know that they follow the seabirds. There's a fish boil there. There's lots of sardines. There's lots of productivity. So the Gulf is very productive. The intertidal zone is very productive. There's lots of species, and they're in high abundance. It supports marine mammals. It used to support an extremely large population of leatherback sea turtles. And just a very quick diversion to talk about the sea turtles. As you probably know that they're endangered. They were commercially fished and sold. But then as soon as the population decreased, it was no longer viable for the commercial fishermen. So they left, but the locals there were still some sea turtles. And they used sea turtles for food. And they had to make a decision. Should we have a sea turtle sanctuary and advertise it as conservation for tourism, or should we keep eating sea turtles? And they actually decided that the money that they raised through that sanctuary, they would divide throughout the town of 500. There's very rare endemic species. So if you hear heron, you think of blue herons, and you don't think of them as being very rare. Here's a cinnamon heron. It only exists on a couple archipelagos, about 32 islands. So more than just this archipelago. So here's a whale that died naturally. It washed up on the beach, and the coyotes came down and fed on it, and lots of insects, and it decomposed. And so the locals waited till it decomposed, and the sun dried it out. They put it back together in front of their museum. But I'm also illustrating that this very large mammal that was feeding in the ocean washes up on shore, and it provides food for animals. This looks very dry. Do you see much plant life? Not much. It's a hyper-arid desert. It is cool in the winter, but it's extremely hot, 110, 114 in the summer. So, some of these islands support a surprisingly high number of animals. How can that be? So the question is, does the productive marine environment subsidize that terrestrial system? And the answer is going to be yes, because I already told you that Gary Polis and his colleagues published a paper both in Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that was titled this Extraordinarily High Spider Densities on Islands. And so it begged the question, how can that be? Another little, so these are the cholla cactus. If you're a plant person, if you can see the cholla cactus, the way they reproduce asexually is those little, why they call them jumping cactus, is because those fall off. It seems like if you get within about a foot of one of these, all of a sudden you'll have a cactus in your leg. So they call them jumping cactus. But that's actually how it reproduces. And so what we're looking here probably is only maybe 1, 2, 3 individuals. But those 3 individuals, so it's clonal, they're all covered with lots and lots of spiders. But you can see how dry it is. So it supports lots of animals that are higher in the trophic level. And the marine system is supporting them. Now this is an odd lizard. If you think of lizards, you usually think of them as carnivores, eating insects. There are 7 that are herbivorous. This is one of them. It's a chuckwalla, but the locals call it iguanas. And so if I say it's a chuckwalla, they'll go, you mean the iguana? And so of course I'll say yes, iguanas. It's a herbivore, but it lives on these islands. And this particular one only lives on these 12 islands. It's the only place that it's still extinct. Now the system is really unproductive, and this is the undergraduate that's now working with the USGS. And as we were on these islands, and we were thinking about the marine system, we also started to turn over some rocks. Students would kick a rock, and some of them would have this green underneath them, and some would. So we quantified that, thinking, well, this might be a big input of productivity. So insects could be eating this, and then the lizards could be eating the insects. And it did lead to her publishing a paper in a very good journal, Soil Biology and Chemistry. But it was only about maybe 3 to 5% of the total productivity of the island. But in some ways, 3 to 5% of cyanobacteria being your base for potential food web is important. So how does this marine environment subsidize the terrestrial environment? You have this algal raft. And if you're brave, you'll go down to that algae and you'll start to pull it apart, and it'll smell bad. And there'll be sea cucumbers in it, and there'll be insects. It'll be full, teeming of life. That it wouldn't be there if you go to this dry part of the sand, you won't find any insects, very few. So this is feeding the terrestrial environment. The seabirds, that white is warm. It doesn't rain very much, so the nitrogen levels really build up. And here's a carcass of a small seabird. So all of these are nutrient inputs that originate in the marine environment. So Gary Polis put together this complex food web. And again, got it published in a very good journal and a number of sort of variations of that. And you'll notice that the marine system is feeding the complex food web. That was new when they discovered that. Now, he was an animal biologist, and he worked with other animal biologists. And you can see that there's no arrows from the marine environment to the plant environment. And that's kind of where I came into the study. So how does this add to a new twist on island biogeography? Well, you go out in wet years, and you go to islands that don't have bird influence, and they have low nitrogen. You go out in dry years, and you sample biomass of plants, and you search for animals, lizards. This is a graduate student. He's now an associate professor at Auburn. And first, an animal relationship. So here's the species area curve for lizards. And this is the predicted line. And you can see that at a certain size island, it fits the prediction. And the z-value is within the range that you would expect. But some of these islands have a very low z-value. And so that begs the explanation why. And the explanation was subsidies. I'll get to that in a minute. But I'll show you the plant data. First, we have species richness. Now, maybe not intuitively, there's higher species richness on non-bird islands with lower nitrogen, so lower productivity. There's fewer species. So now if you think about that hump-shaped curve, so this is your test, where are we on the hump-shaped curve with plants? So, in wet years, productivity is higher on non-bird islands, and it's higher on bird islands, but it's much higher on bird islands. And in dry years, it's lower, but it follows that same nutrient input relationship. And if you look at the species richness of annual plants, again, if you look at all of the islands, you get a z-value that was just like the lizards and fits within the predictions of island biogeography. But if you look at the bird islands, they're slightly above what would normally be predicted. They're at a very high range. And the non-bird islands are low, or just a bit lower than the expected range. So, how are we going to explain this? We'll look at productivity, and the answer to your quiz, how many people got it? You are on the descending part of the hump-shaped curve. Everybody got that? Everybody gets an A tonight? Just one laugh, that's good. So, you look at total productivity versus diversity, and you take that hump-shaped curve, and you color it, one side one color, and the other side another color. That's also a go. But what you ask is, where are you on that diversity productivity curve? And then you do the species area relationships, and if you fall above the curve, the prediction is that you're over here. If you fall below the curve, the prediction is that you're on this side of the hump-shaped curve. This has been verified. It's also been tweaked itself. So what is the conservation application? If you flew here or you drove here, you know that our habitats are fragmented. And so if you're a species, if you're a bird that happens to like agriculture, in this case this is in Ecuador, flying over the rainforest, and these are palm plantations. There's some secondary forest, but it's a patchwork of different habitats that support different species. Here's flying over Oregon, and so you get these patches. Because you'll have species who like this type of area that's open, and you'll have species that really like these. So you have these islands, and the idea of the subsidized island biogeography hypothesis, truly just a hypothesis at this point, is that maybe we can use it in conservation to look at fragmented systems. Here it's much more complicated. Because we have the marine system and the terrestrial system, there's no question that those are two different types of habitats. Here it gets a little bit more messy. So, are these desert islands feeding on a sea of riches? Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Questions?
I'd be happy to entertain questions at this time. Yes?
On the diversity productivity curve, when there's going to be a discontinuous break in the curve. Two questions. What causes the discontinuity? What causes the position of that?
It's usually scale. And so it might be whether you're going from a low elevation to a high elevation, and sampling across that, or sampling across the latitude. When they do manipulations, they actually graph the x-axis on the y-axis. And also, so you often see that hump-shaped curve with work like Tillman's work with the prairie plants, increasing productivity and seeing how there's more species. So I'm not sure, does that answer your question?
Maybe back one. Maybe I used the wrong. Then if you go back where you had the curve that goes up and it suddenly drops. That curve on the left.
This one.
Yeah, the biomass, species number of biomass. How is that? What determines where that peak is, and why is there a sudden sharp change?
Usually this is explained by the species that are down here, that they're very stress tolerant. So there's very few species that are stress tolerant. And then as you increase, you get more generalized plants. You don't have to be really specialized.
But what's something that changes?
Usually they evoke competition. So once you start to get here, all of a sudden competition intensity becomes great. So if you go to areas where there's only one or two species, and there's really, they're keeping all of the other species out. Did you have one more question? No. Any other? Yes.
So for the fragmentation, and you're talking about applying this principle from an island to what we use today for our terrestrial, because our use of like the land and everything else is fragmenting the ecology. Would it affect the principle if, like, because with this certain one, all the marine went into the terrestrial, but for others, like terrestrial places, would it affect it if it's going both ways? Like, these may be supplying a certain resource while the other one is applying a certain resource. Would that affect the
Yes,
principle?
and they actually have described that. They call it cross-ecosystem transfer. But you can go back to the island and think about that. Usually, if you think about like a watershed, right? So if you think about the island, all the water that falls on that island is really going to go back into the ocean. So usually productivity flows out of the watershed or out of the island into the marine system. So it's cross-ecosystem. So now when you get into a fragment and you have another fragment, you can have cross-ecosystem transfers. A really good example of cross-ecosystem is brown bears and grizzly bears that will feed on the salmon. So the salmon spawned in the river, they went out into the ocean, they fed, they came back to spawn, and the bears come and they take the salmon and they take it back on shore and they consume most of it. Sometimes they don't even really, they must be having fun. Sometimes they just go back because there's so many. You'll see those pictures of the bears. So they're transferring that salmon. There's the carcass that they leave, and plus there's the defecation of the bear. And so you can actually follow that cross ecosystem. Yes?
Has this model been applied to cave ecosystems, because they also get these pulses of organic material from animals crawling into caves and dying or defecating or whatever?
Not that I know of. So I have not seen any papers on cave systems that have looked at that. But that would be a really interesting, and one thing about these kind of ideas is that sometimes you can use data sets, so you could go into the bat literature and you might be able to tease that out. But I'm not aware personally of any cave studies. But it's, I mean, right, the bats are going out, coming back in.
We talked a wee bit about the sea turtle situation. Did you see any evidence of any other kind of man-made alterations of these ecosystems? Something that basically people are maybe going to do, or are these islands pretty much off limits?
These islands now are pretty much off limits. It is a Mexican national park. It is part of a UNESCO site. And the other thing is that after the accident, the permitting process for researchers, I'm sorry. My talk's up. So, I swear it's all one thing. Now they're technical. Now they're doing technology.
I'm distracted by the music. So you talked about the situation with the sea turtles and how they were always taken to the point of extinction and then changed from the then. So was there any evidence in looking maybe a wee bit more historical record just of how mankind has maybe affected these islands, and how does that kind of affect your data? If we come in and we say decide to start eating all the lizards,
so this actually used to be commercially fished not only for the sea turtles, but as a commercial fish, and they used trawlers. And for some reason, the Mexican government allowed Chinese to come in, and so when they overfished it, they left. But as ecologists, one thing that Gary Polis was looking at is he wanted to look at a pristine system. So here you are in the middle of nowhere. Nobody lives on this island, even that really, really big island. There's some fishing camps, but there's no permanent habitat. So it's a relatively pristine, but you'll often find fishing nets that attract sea animals. They come up on shore. An odd little twist is that drug runners use these islands, and so they will often lose some of their bales, but you will find evidence that drug runners were on these islands. So, and they're really not, I don't think, on themselves. They can't. So the human influences are small, but they're there. And there's also a big issue. So, for example, there was one Pelican Island, and we were asked not by the seabird ecologists, don't go to the Pelican Island during this period of time, because even just your presence, landing your boat, and getting off, will disrupt those pelicans. And so, small influences are still there. Is that good enough examples? Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious if there's any interesting examples of speciation on the islands that are unique to the archipelago, and if you can comment on that. Any interesting species there? Other than the ones you've already noted.
There's a book, The Island Biogeography of the Sea of Cortez. And then they came out with a second edition about 8 or 10 years ago. And they do address that. But I don't know of any particular examples. I do know that when my student was doing the lizard study, he was mainly taking little pieces of the tail and using it for isotopes, carbon isotopes, nitrogen isotopes to track. But he did verify the species by the DNA. So I don't think it's well studied enough. I do know in the second edition they do address some speciation events, but I don't know of any really specific examples. But it'd be a prime place for it because it's so isolated.
Yeah.
And that chuckwalla would be a great study, since it's only found on those 12 islands. And but unfortunately the populations are so low. And sometimes we would see one individual on one island, and we could track that individual for a couple of years, but it was the only one on the island. So that's imminent extinction for that particular island until there's a new colonization. Any other questions? Well, I thank you very much.